Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is another episode of Let's Talk Broncos. I haven't really come up with a name for the show yet, but I'm interviewing some of my favorite draft analysts on my way up to the draft. Last week I had Devin Jackson on, talk some defensive line, and this week we got Ian Cummings of Pro Football Network on. Ian, how are you doing? And then also I'm trying to figure out how many scattering reports have you written this year because it's absurd.
I know, right? I gotta. Sometimes I lose track, man. First off, I'm doing good. It's busy, but that's the name
Yeah.
of the game this year. We're prepping for the combine next week, which will be a fun event for sure. So we're doing that. But I think we have a running table, and I think we're up to over 150. So we're getting up there. We're trying to, you want to keep going. You don't want to stop because like all these prospects deserve mentioning and representation. That's one thing that stands out to me every year, but I think in particular the past few years, and I think next year too with the COVID year. But these classes are a lot deeper across the board, right? And good players fall every year. Good players go undrafted every year, so really can't leave any stone unturned. And that's kind of where the whole what's the word that I'm looking for? The initiative for the scouting reports comes from.
No, you're absolutely right. Like you've written that many, which is like I said, absurd. And then even still, I was looking at your recently written articles today. You're still writing articles on some ballers, like some actual real prospects, which is cool. It just shows the depth of this class, like you said. Uh, but Ian, I read your article on the top quarterbacks. Let's get into what sells the tickets, and that's the quarterback position. The
Mhm.
Broncos are obviously need a quarterback. In your latest mock draft, you put them to get Bo Nix. Can you let us know here in Broncos country? It feels like it's a 50-50 split. Some people love him, some people hate him. Um, why that makes sense for the Broncos?
Yeah, and I think for the Broncos, it's tough because you're not really in a position where you can get Caleb Williams or Drake May, right? Like
Yeah,
in a dream, right? But the top two teams, the Bears and the Commanders, it's very likely that they take him, right? So it's kind of unrealistic. And then you got Jaden Daniels, JJ McCarthy, maybe, right? But there are a few other QB needy teams vying for those spots too. So I think the dominoes will continue to fall in free agency, right? So we'll have a clearer picture as we always do, but for Bo Nix, I think he's a very polarizing prospect, and that's something that
right.
we've seen going back to his days at Auburn too, right? At Auburn definitely had a lot of work to do, but you could at least see the talent there, and that's one thing. Like when people talk about his floor and ceiling evaluation, like I do want to emphasize he does have legitimate talent. Like this is not a guy who's a middling floor type of quarterback, right? Maybe not an elite arm in terms of strength, but his arm elasticity, his ability to generate velocity off platform to manipulate arm angles, right? That is a very strong part of his game. And then he's such a smooth off platform thrower. He's a really good creator, very good short area agility, change of direction, good frame density too. So he's got some creation tools that are very high level, right? And we saw that at Auburn, but I think at Oregon, it was good because he was in a system that channeled that and allowed him to become a more efficient distributor, right? And that kind of correlated that kind of culminated in the 2023 season. 2022 was very good, but 2023 right broke the CFB record for completion percentage, right, which
Right.
is very impressive, right? You never want to use those stats without context, but you see it on tape. Bo Nix is a guy who is always in control, right? Even when he's off script now. I think there's a new level of coordination and control and discipline with those high end tools that he has, and that's always a good thing. I think the big question for Nix is what is the ceiling, right? We know he's got physical ability. We know he's a very smooth distributor and creator, and I think those two tools in tandem are very valuable. But those intermediate reads in particular, those layered NFL reads that are a little bit tougher to make, that you need to anticipate a little more consistently, that's not as big in his repertoire, right? This is a guy who had a lot of short range passes, and he's a very good distributor in the short range with that accuracy. And he has flashed the ability to anticipate over the middle of the field, right, with those in breakers. But it's something that's not a very routine part of his game, and so that's the question: can he integrate that at the next level, or as a processor? Is he limited to that, rhythm passing, short range? And to give him credit too, a lot of that's just as much him as it is the offensive scheme, because pre-snap he was very active at Oregon, putting his
Yeah.
players in optimal matchups, right? So I want to preface with that too. Like this is not a guy who's just being inserted and just doing what they tell him, right? He's got some pre-snap autonomy, and that's a very good thing. It's just, can he anticipate at the level that you need to make the NFL throws that you need to make at the end of the day? I think that's the biggest question for him. I would provide some solace for Broncos fans. I understand the reservations picking them that high, but I do think there's enough talent to work with. It's just at 24 years old. The question is, how much can we get from a processing standpoint?
Yeah, and it feels it's really interesting because just outside of Broncos country, it feels like every mock draft has Bo Nix going to the Broncos. It just is that just like a pairing with him and Sean Payton. You see, there's something
Yeah.
you really like there.
It's a fun match for sure because I
Mhm.
think with Sean Payton, the biggest thing is working the middle of the field, but also, having the willingness to not just that, but having the willingness to distribute, right? Get the ball out
Right.
quick, work within the confines of the offense. And I think if anything, Bo Nix proved that at Oregon. If there was one thing he proved, it's that he can work within the confines of the offense. He can be a distributor, keep things on schedule, right? There are some times where he'll add a little bit with his footwork still. You want to be a little more disciplined, but he can do that because he is so athletic and he is so smooth off platform, right? Always keeps his shoulders level and he has that arm elasticity to correct his precision if needed. So I think, the tools are there. Like Russell Wilson, the biggest thing was, he's not a very good fit for that offense because he would always be looking for the big play, right?
Yeah.
He isn't really working the middle of the field, right? I think with Bo Nix, you have a very capable distributor in that lens who can also expand a little bit beyond that with his creationary tools. So, putting him in Sean Payton's offense, I think you're going to see more discipline, more willingness to work on schedule, and, if they can scheme weapons in optimal situations, Bo Nix has the accuracy to make those chances and convert on those chances. So I think that's where the fit comes from. Just work in the middle of the field, just being a distributor, just doing what the offense tells you to do, but also expanding beyond that a little bit. I think that's kind of where it falls into place.
No, absolutely. And I think that is ultimately word of the day. Word of the year for Broncos country is we're looking for a more, I guess, on schedule type thrower in a Sean Payton um, offense. That's something that was clear as day with Russell Wilson because it wasn't even just over the middle. Obviously, that wasn't working, but the quick game doesn't work with Russell Wilson either. So
Mhm.
that was a huge issue. But
And that's
what
one
put
thing where Nix is very strong is the quick
I,
game.
absolutely, absolutely. That's a great call because he is. That is a very big strong suit of his. But what puts him in your mind ahead of a JJ McCarthy, where we didn't see the volume passing from JJ McCarthy, but I feel like out of that Harbaugh offense, we saw more NFL concepts. I would say. Well, what puts Nix over McCarthy in your mind?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say over. I think it's, as many mock drafts as Nix goes before him, McCarthy goes before Nix. And I think
Okay.
that's only going to continue to accelerate too, because we're seeing him climb up the board. We're kind of getting that smoke that he's probably going to go top 10, right? So I think it's more a question of, is McCarthy even going to be available for them, right? Or they might have to trade up if they want to get him. So
Absolutely.
that's the question. They're graded from a raw grade perspective. They're graded very close for me. And in that article, I believe I did have Bo Nix over him slightly. I think it was Nix 4, McCarthy 5, and Penix 6, if I remember correctly. I am going to reevaluate that because they are graded so close for me. How my grading scale works is it lands players into certain brackets, and then within those brackets, I leave some freedom for subjective realignment, right? If a
Mhm.
prospect is younger, for example, that's going to be the biggest thing with JJ McCarthy because he's only 21 years old. Bo Nix is 24, right? Not only do you have a longer developmental track, but there's also a better chance that McCarthy isn't set in his ways. He still has room to keep growing, right? With Nix, you worry if some of those flaws that may keep him from being an elite quarterback are going to stay and linger, right? So those are the biggest
Mhm.
questions. But I think, if you're asking what would put Nix over McCarthy, I think right now the operational consistency, right? I think right now McCarthy, the biggest thing for him in 2023 was we wanted to see him improve in the pocket with his poise. We wanted to see him become more autonomous as a processor and a field manipulator, right? And I think early in the year we did see a lot of that. I think against I can't remember what team it was, but some of those early games against weaker competition. To be fair, he was moving in the pocket and navigating those creases and using pump fakes to draw defenders out of throwing lanes, right, and then capitalizing, right. So lofting it into tight windows and layering passes, right. And there were some passes down the stretch that were very impressive too. That touchdown. It was either against Michigan State or Ohio State, where as soon as he sees the defender trail his guy up the seam, he's throwing it into an incredibly tight window, right?
Mhm.
Like that fearlessness to test the middle of the field. Those things are all there. It's just how consistent is it going to be on day one, right? Because you're looking at a guy who down the stretch was not asked to elevate that offensive tongue, right? And to be fair, he wouldn't have had to anyway. I mean, that offensive line was phenomenal. The running game was phenomenal. The defense was incredible, right? It was a team that seemed destined for a national championship just because of how
Yeah.
strong they were. So McCarthy didn't have to do a lot to get them there. but he wasn't asked to either. And there is kind of a question like, why wasn't he? Right? Because he is so talented. So, for NFL teams, I think that operational consistency, right? That's going to be the biggest thing because there are still lapses in decision making sometimes. There are still instances where the field vision is a little bit questionable, right? It's hot and cold. It's there sometimes. It is there sometimes, but sometimes it isn't, right? It's not like a prospect farther than where like Joe Milton, for example, who you can tell a lot is, very, I hate to rag on a guy, but, just getting an example in there, like you can tell that Tennessee offense is very scripted and there isn't a lot of, autonomous field vision there. With JJ McCarthy, there are flashes of it for sure. Tangibly, we know it's there, but how often is it going to be there? Can we rely on it, right? That's the biggest question. I think with Bo Nix, you have a guy who you can build an offense around a little bit easier on day one. So I think for Sean Payton, if you want to compete right away, Bo Nix probably provides a better runway for that.
Yeah, well, I think that's important to note because just of Sean Payton's age as well, you've already seen him retire once, right? So is that looming? Is that coming in the future? Does he want someone to come in right away? Or is he looking for more of a developmental prospect? That's something that keep in mind. And speaking of kind of, developmental prospect, I don't think this player is going to be a first-round pick by any means, Ian, but a guy I'm curious to know, how far back is he from the McCarthys, the Nixes, the Penixes? How far is Rattler away from those guys, in your opinion?
The more I think about it, the smaller the gap is.
Yeah,
That's kind of
I've been
how I'm
thinking the
feeling.
same thing, so that's
Yeah,
why I asked.
it's interesting with him. I think, there's still an overarching need for consistency, I think, and I say that a lot. I think with him, it's there too. I think there are times when, you know, it's tough because that South Carolina supporting cast was not great this year. The offensive line was not great. A lot of pressure. Now there are still times where he'll drift back a little bit too far. I think the pocket depth can still be a little more consistent with him. I think he did show some growth this year though within the confines of that. And I think the Senior Bowl was really big for him because we got to see him in a new offense with a lot of moving pieces, right? And he was probably the best quarterback there, and from day one, he was very comfortable. He was commanding the offense and he was going through progressions quickly, right? He was making quick reads. He was managing the pocket, and the arm talent, I think, is the biggest thing because if you're an NFL team, all the boxes you want to check, right? Is he a good leader? And he seems very matured from his days at Oklahoma. That was another thing that's been very clear listening to him talk, right? And I think he was a captain in South Carolina in his final year. So, he's come a long way since then. And looking at that, if you're an NFL team within that lens, if he's got the arm talent, if he's got the accuracy, which he is fairly accurate, I think he's got fairly solid natural throwing mechanics, right? If he's got the necessary processing ability, I think it's there. I think like many of these guys, it's a little hot and cold, but it's definitely there. And if he has the ability to, just kind of take that next step, I think the developmental starting potential is there. And for an NFL team, especially with the medical questions with Penix, right, that might be a separating factor. Because I think Michael Penix Jr., if it's just about the on-field stuff, he's a top 50 guy for sure. But you look at the medical history, 2 shoulder issues, and the 2 torn ACLs, right? Like if I'm looking at that and then I'm looking at Rattler over here, like here's a veteran quarterback who's actually shown a lot of good things, right? And he's got that high-end arm talent and elasticity to layer throws into tight windows and to push it outside the numbers, right? So I look at him, man, and I think if you're thinking about a veteran who has enough flaws to keep people from, going head over heels for him, but has the starting talent, you can put him, Nix, and Penix into that bucket, right? So it's like the more I think about it, the smaller the gap is. I still have it from a grade perspective as Nix, Penix, and Rattler, but I do think there is an argument to make for Rattler because he's got the creation capacity. He's got the arm talent. He's grown as a, leader and off-field presence. And, there are some little snippets to take away on the operational side that, hey, maybe there's something to work with here.
Absolutely. And then, it's funny talking about the quarterbacks because Broncos, they sit at pick 12, and it feels like every single time you sit in kind of that range, you're pretty much reaching at quarterback. There's no way around that. If you're at pick 12, you're taking the guy that's going to be probably like 25th or lower on your big board there if you want a quarterback. It's no, just because of the positional value and the need there around the league at quarterback, everyone's going to take him higher than the rest. So it's just an interesting conversation to have. Like if you can get Rattler later, than you can get a Nix or Penix, and they're all kind of in that same bucket. I don't know. It's just something to think about for Broncos country. But I want to get into the main topic of today, and I wanted to talk to you about the offensive line. Like I said, I talked to Devin last week about defensive line. Wanted to talk to you about offensive line. I've been reading up a bunch of your articles and stuff like that. Something I always wonder as a scout, and just want to, or while I'm watching these guys,
Mhm.
and I don't know if you have an answer to this or not, but I thought I'd ask anyways. What gives a tackle versatility? It's always funny to me listening people. They're saying this guy's strictly a right tackle, but and then there's another guy still only right tackle experience ever in his career. Maybe he could switch to left tackle though. This guy, what makes that difference? What are you looking for from a left tackle from a right tackle?
Yeah, it's a good question because you have a few guys in this class that are candidates to move, like Taliese Fuaga from Oregon State. I know a lot of people have been talking
Mm,
about like what if he goes to a team that needs a left tackle, right, or Tyler Guyton or something, right? So
right.
there are a lot of candidates. It's different for me though, going from left tackle to right tackle or right tackle to left tackle. And I
Okay.
think if you're ever going to make a move, some baseline things like that I look for personally. Like one reason that I believe Fuaga could play left tackle. One reason I believe that is for an athlete, in terms of his mobility, he's very balanced. He's very coordinated, right? Those are things that I look for because I think those are things that are translatable when you're trying to mirror your pass sets, right? Because everything is mirrored on the other side. It's an adjustment. So I want guys who have that natural balance, that natural,
Right.
flexibility, corrective fail safe, so that can help them as they're going through that. So that's one thing I look for that switch. If I'm designated a left tackle to right tackle, it means I'm not super confident in that left tackle's ability to stay there, right?
Mhm.
Patrick Paul from Houston is one example in this class. I think he's a mountainous tackle, right? 6'7", 315, over
Mm.
36-inch arms. The dude is massive, but the recovery athleticism isn't great. I still think there's a lot of technical work to do. Keeps his hands too wide, he'll expose himself to power. The counter punches can be a little slow at times. So I'm looking at him. I would rather, if I'm gonna get him starting reps, right, which someone is gonna bank on those tools. I want him on the right side where he's in the quarterback's line of vision, unless you're Miami, right? There's outlier
Right.
there, but usually, if you're a right-handed quarterback, your right tackle is in your line of vision, so it's a little easier to evade if you need to, right? So that's if I'm moving a guy from left tackle to right tackle, that's usually what it is. I think that they would function better in the quarterback's line of sight, give the quarterback a little bit of room to recover because that tackle isn't quite as athletic.
Got it.
But if I'm moving them from right to left, it's because I think they have the corrective fail safes necessary to go through that move.
Got it. Okay, so that's really interesting. Um, yeah, and I ask that because this is such a strong right tackle class, and we'll start getting into the prospects here in a second, especially in that Broncos range. Like, I don't think the Broncos realistically have a shot at Joe Alt. I don't think they really have a great shot at Fashanu as either. Like, those guys are probably out of their range, both left tackles, and I think the Broncos. For how much Mike McGlinchey struggled last year, you just signed the guy. You can't get rid of him. And I think Garrett Bowles is probably a stronger trade candidate from everything I've heard with the Broncos. So I would be looking for a guy to play left tackle for the Broncos. Is there a guy that would sit around that 12th pick in the draft that you think could play left tackle for the Broncos? Maybe even it's a day one guy. Maybe he struggles out the gate, but you could see that transition happening.
Two guys that come to mind for me, Tyler Guyton. I think he's a natural right tackle, right? So you're going to have to work with that. But I think for me, 6'7", 328, really long player, really powerful punches, right? Really good latch violence, right? But I think for him, we talked about that corrective failsafe, and he's such
Mm,
a flexible athlete, right? I think that's the thing that gets me with him. He's a little bit underdeveloped as a run blocker. He's very tenacious. I love that. I think that'll translate. I think the length and athleticism will translate. I want him to work on his pad level and base load and power drive
absolutely.
as a run blocker. I think he can be more consistent there. But as a pass protector, his pass sets are so clean. I mean, he gets really good depth on his kick. He's very good at playing with controlled lean and using his flexibility to align himself, right? and then using that alignment to expand his reach and wall off the apex, right? He's so good at that. And so I think that flexibility, that recovery athleticism that he has, it was fun because I was studying him and I was like just kind of doing a deep dive, and I found out he played defensive tackle in high school. So you find his huddle highlights, and he's out here winning with swim moves, right, dipping
Love it.
rips at 6'7", like 280, right? So it's like the dude's got a ton of flexibility, and I think that really helps not just with his leverage acquisition, but that corrective failsafe, like we talked about. So I think he'll take his lumps early on because he is very raw. Like, he doesn't have a ton of starting experience, so you're going to have some lumps. But I think that balance and that cleanliness with his pass sets will help very early on. And then I think the other candidate for number 12 would be Amarius Mims from Georgia. I
Okay.
think he's another one that's kind of in the same boat, doesn't have a ton of starting experience. I think the bigger issue will be medicals for him because he did miss some time with the ankle injury. There were a few games that he was in that he missed a few reps, got banged up, came back in, right? So you wonder about the durability, 6'7", 330. But I think if he passes the medical check, he's a very good athlete. He's a very powerful run blocker, right? He can maul guys in space. He can finish in the dirt. And I think for his age, right, again, some of the building blocks in pass protection, like leveraging your base, maintaining synergy with your hands and your feet, kind of aligning yourself, and all of those things. I think he's a little bit better than Broderick Jones was at this time last cycle. I think he's already pretty natural with some of those building blocks and pass protection again. So I think Amarius Mims, and the good thing with him is he's got experience at left and right already, right? He doesn't have a ton of experience, but he has shown he can play both sides. So in a limited sample. So
Right.
I think there's a little bit more, credence to play him at left tackle right away, and he should be fairly comfortable there. So those are the two names that come to mind. I know there are a lot of really good tackles at the tail end of round one. I'm blanking on a few of the names, but like Kingsley Suamataia from BYU again. But I think those two guys are probably the best ones at 12. Anyone
Okay.
else, I think it would be a little bit too rich for them. And of course, Fuaga, but we already talked about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think both with Mims and Guyton, something fans need to look at more is just how much do you like your offensive line coach, right? Or how much do you like your developers there? Because I think both of them, you're not really expecting them to be very clean coming in because what they haven't really shown clean play yet. Both of them, it's a lot more of projection involved with both Mims and Guyton. So yeah, I don't know. For the Broncos' perspective, they have Zach Strief as their offensive line coach. He had a great year one. You got the best year of his career out of Lloyd Cushenberry. You had Garrett Bowles playing at a high level off a broken leg. There are a lot of, and then Quinn Miners, who I thought would play like one of the best guards in football this year. So hopefully that is continued, and hopefully you trust that guy to ultimately take a Guyton or a Mims. Someone I wanted to talk to you about, Ian, was Troy Fatanu out of Washington. I'm curious. I look at him on tape, and I'm like, okay, he definitely looks like a guard to me. Like, absolutely looks like a guard. And then I watch him, like, can this guy play tackle? Where do you evaluate him? Because while he looks like a guard, he had really good tape at tackle to me.
Yeah, and I think it's funny. I was just going to mention him. I was actually thinking like, oh, I should have mentioned Fatanu. I don't know why I did. So yeah, I think that's a good. I think particularly if you're the Broncos, if you want to trade back to like the 20s or something,
Yeah.
you know, get some extra capital, you can maybe get him there. That would be a really good play. I think. I think he can stick a tackle because I think what are the things that usually move a guy inside, right? You're looking at lateral mobility limitations or you're looking at length limitations. And he doesn't have either of those things. He's like 6'4", 320. He's got over 34-inch arms, so length is not an issue for him. And then he's very athletic. I think the recovery athleticism is something that really stood out to me. Not just the lateral mobility to match rushers in phase, but also the ability to close ground and explode laterally, right? To kind of recover positioning. And he's very good at using upper lower synergy, right? Really steady base, well matching guys and staying square. But then he's shown he can use combative hands too. He's got a snatch and trap. He's very powerful with his extensions. So I think with Troy Fatanu, you look at it first. Does he have to move to guard? He does have experience at guard and tackle, but I think he can play at tackle because, like we said, He's got the length, he's got the athleticism, the recovery athleticism, and then at 6'4" with 34-inch arms, it's also a really good natural leverage and length combination, right? He
Yeah.
can play low, he's got good pad level, and he can get inside your frame, right? So you love to have that combination. I don't think he has to move. I think he can stay tackle, and I think he's a very good value proposition if you want to trade down and get some capital, because there's definitely a lot of upside there.
And also with him, I feel like there's extra value there because I think his floor is pretty high because I feel like I could kick him in the guard or maybe even center from what I saw, right? Like I think either of these things, and I am pretty confident saying I'm getting a good interior offensive lineman too. Whereas I can't say that with a guy like Tyler Guyton. I don't think he has the frame to play a guard or a center or something like that. You can kind of just look and tell. Although Tyler Guyton's size plus athleticism is one of the craziest things. Do you look at him and Mims? You mentioned them earlier. After the combine, I'm not so sure it's the actual NFL scouts that are rising and falling as much as the fans are and the media are. But are these guys that I should expect to be more in that range for mocked and publicly put out there for the Broncos, you think? Because they're both freak athletes.
Yeah, I think they're gonna go top half of round one. If I had to guess, if I had to
Yeah.
put, maybe not Mims, maybe Mims sneaks just outside it, right? Because it's difficult because there are a lot of big ticket prospects at positions like, well, first off, you're probably gonna have 4 or 5 quarterbacks go in the top 15, right? You're probably gonna have a few wide receivers, right? 3 wide receivers at least. You're gonna have a few offensive tackles. You got Oldu and Joe Alt off the bat, Brock Bowers probably, right? So
Right.
there are a lot of good blue chip players in this class. That was one thing that was clear to me in the evaluation, is that the amount of blue chip talent is a lot higher than it usually is, which is a good thing, right? But at the same time, it's kind of hard to project where guys land. I think Guyton will definitely be a top 15 pick, though. I think Guyton, the youth, the athleticism, what he showed at the Senior Bowl, not just with his athleticism and his flexibility, but his competitiveness too, I think that will win over NFL teams. And then I
Yeah.
think Amarius Mims, again, you have the versatility. He's a little bit of a wild card because I think Taliese Fuaga will probably go top 15 too. I look at the Jets as a potential match for him. I look at the Raiders again; it's probably a floor for him, right? Or the Saints potentially. So there are a lot of OL needy teams and a lot of quality OL. So it's going to come down to who gets shuffled out with the other prospects on the board. But the upside is there. I look at Guyton, I look at the Raiders as a good floor for him too. I think, just the upside, the youth, those are things that teams bank on. I think those are accelerants at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, we have so many of those ginormous, huge, but also really great moving guys here in the first round between Mims, Latham, Fuaga. Like it's absurd the tackles that are coming out now and the athleticism plus size we're getting from these guys. It's crazy. I don't feel like I've seen this for a little bit, but I want to move into the interior of the offensive line. Ian Lloyd Cushenberry for the Broncos is a free agent this year, and if you read between the lines here, I feel like the Broncos are going to let him walk. Jackson Power Johnson is obviously a guy that comes to mind. 12 might be early for him just because of the position. I think though that he's a pretty slam dunk of a pick. How do you feel about him?
Yeah, my gut feeling is that we need to kind of look at how we value centers, because it's really valuable, man. I think
Yeah.
honestly, like having a good player at the fulcrum of the line, not just for communication purposes, but a lot of the best rushers in the league are coming from the interior right now. And if
Mhm.
you get interior pressure, the quarterback can't step up. That interrupts his process, right? So I think a tackle is obviously valuable, especially a blindside tackle, because he's not in the quarterback's line of vision. So you want him to be rock solid, right? But I think center is just as important. And if you can get a guy like Jackson Powers Johnson, like you said, pretty rock solid prospect. The more I looked at him, he scored a high grade for me initially. But the more I looked back at him, I'm like, I really can't poke too many holes in his
Right.
game. And he's a 21-year-old, right? Like, this is his first year
Yep.
full time starting, right? And he won the Remington Award. So it's like, and they dominated the Senior Bowl. 6'3", 330, the play strength, the power, the athleticism, the football IQ, right? The leveraging, the hand strength. And the one thing that really gets me with him is he's a blocky guy, right? He's a pretty blocky dude. And yet, the amount of torque that he can uncork on his punches and his extensions is insane. Like his rotational freedom within that is so impressive, and he can just dislodge defenders in the interior. So it's a very fun thing to watch. And I think with him, you could be getting a impact starter, a potential All-Pro down the line. So if he's there at 12, which he's going to be there at 12, but I think honestly, I would at least keep him on the board, right? I
I think
would,
so too.
because
Yeah.
I know tackle is a big need, and I know tackle is a very valuable position, but just getting that kind of player at center and locking him down, I do think we undervalue it a little bit, right? And I think another factor that may come into play for them is how deep they feel each positional group is, right? Because I think with tackle, there is a chance you could wait until round 3 and maybe get a solid player, right?
Right.
With center, there are only a select few guys that can start on day 1 in the draft. You got Jackson Miller-Johnson, you got Zach Frazier, you got Graham Barton, and maybe Cedric Van Pran. I think Van Pran still has some improvement with his power absorption, right? So I think even that's you're kind of getting on the fringe there already, right? So it may come down to that. Maybe they're not even considering it. Maybe they get a stopgap in free agency or something like that, or maybe they get a guy with more center guard flex later on and hope they can insert them in. But I do think he's that caliber of player where you at least have to keep that option open.
No, absolutely. Like even if I start going down the list here and I'm just like, is Jackson Power Johnson a better center than Tyler Guyton is a tackle? I think that's a conversation to be had, right? Like Jackson Powers Johnson is, I think, a day 1 starter immediately, and someone you can just kind of write down in your books as this is a guy that's going to be here for at least the next 5 years until I want to give him a contract extension bearing injury. I really think that highly from what I saw from him. And I wonder how far our kid from Duke, what is his name? I'm forgetting his name real quick.
Graham Barton.
Graham Barton is from that, because I really like Graham Barton's film as well. Obviously played tackle there and is transitioning in the guard. It's an easy transition, I feel. He's not a tackle in the pros, so he's going to have to kick in into the interior of the offensive line, whether that be guard or center. Tell me why center makes sense for him.
Well, first off, I mean, he played there his freshman year, I believe. It was either his freshman or redshirt freshman. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I know he has a full year of starting experience at center. So you've already got something to build off of there, right? So I think that in and of itself is a good thing. Having that experience, that familiarity can help ease the transition. But I think his traits translate really well, too. I think you have a player who at 6'5", 314, around there, for his size is very good, again, at acquiring leverage, playing with controlled knee bend. He's very good at staying square, kind of using that to play with leverage. And then he's a very good hand fighter at pass protection. He'll stay square, he'll combat extensions. A lot of the little things come very easily to him, aligning himself, just processing and responding and reacting and kind of, recalibrating his base and his set. And he's also a road grader as a bonus, right? You look at the athleticism off the line, the explosiveness, the ability to drive power from that momentum and finish through blocks is very impressive to me. So I think you have a guy who at center, he can get out, he can pull, he's got range, he's got physicality, but he also has the football IQ, the vision, the leveraging, right? The little soft skills that make him a reliable cog at the center of the line. Things that I would give me confidence, right? So I think it will be a little bit of a transition moving back, but I think that familiarity will ease it, kind of make it a quicker one. So, I would play him at guard or center. I'd be comfortable with either one, but for the Broncos, if you can get him at center, I think that's another trade back option where you can probably trade back to the 20s, get some more capital, right? So another factor that comes in for the Broncos, because you have a lot of work to do with that roster, right? So if you can trade back and get a guy, that might be a good option. I think Barton is definitely a good candidate.
No, absolutely. It just, I think that's the dream scenario for the Broncos, in my opinion, is that hopefully JJ McCarthy or one of these quarterbacks is there at 12, where they can be, do I want the quarterback, or it gives them a healthy trade back option?
And that's the tough part, man, because you need a quarterback. You do need a quarterback, but you need a lot of other things too. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, they need a lot of other things is right. And then, so hey, I think I got a really good opinion here of the first round offensive lineman. I want to ask you, is there someone that you went into the tape this season? Because there are a few for me where, I was kind of reading up on some of these guys and, okay, cool, I think I have an opinion on them. And they impressed you a lot more than you figured. Who would that offensive lineman be for you, if any?
There's a few. It's tough to narrow it down. That's the
Yeah,
problem here.
it's
A
fun
few.
finding those guys too, right?
Yeah, it's fun finding those guys, and I think this offensive line class has quite a few. I'll limit myself to three.
Okay.
I think Kieran Amagaji from Yale is
Ooh.
one that I was big on since the summer. He's been a top 100 guy for me since then, and I think that we're starting to see him get some more buzz a little bit. I know Dane Brugler wrote a great piece about him, but you can tell that the smarts are there, the intelligence is there, but this dude is one of the highest ceiling guys in the entire class. I mean, he
Ooh.
is 6'5", 320, over 36-inch arms, right? So a build a tackle, right? If you could build one in a lab, he's explosive. He's got very, very good recovery athleticism, very good lateral burst. Pretty good at aligning himself. I think pad level can be a little bit inconsistent, but you're still working with a lot of tools. His anchor strength is suffocating, and he's a mauler, man. Like, he will finish blocks if you give up leverage as a defensive lineman. So Kieran Amagaji, I'm a big fan, and he can play tackle or guard. He's got experience in both spots. So if you want to move him around, he could be an absolute road grader at guard too. So I think just get that guy with his tools, his intelligence, and his developmental capacity in your room, and let him become what he can become, because I think that's a lot of upside. A couple others that stand out to me: Delmar Glaze from Maryland was one.
Okay.
I like him as more of a fringe top 100 guy, but I think the the pass sets again are very clean. A lot of the little things, right, like the lateral mobility. Like, I was very smooth out of his sets, right. I think for him, the biggest thing I want him to improve on is loading his base a little bit more, anchoring a little bit better against
Mhm.
power, because there are times where he gets his hands in the right spot. He's got really good grip strength, but he just doesn't roll his base back enough, and then that can cause him to be moved a little bit easier. But I think he's around 6'4", 3/8 or something, 320, with again over 34-inch arms. So really good profile you're working with there. He's athletic. He's got really good flashes of corrective mobility and kind of twitch out of his stance, right? That kind of quickness to recalibrate at a moment's notice. And he's got flashes of really good hand usage too. I think he can improve a little bit with his precision, but he does flash some good execution, snatch and trap, right? And the anchor placement is very good with him too. So,
Well,
and
that's a new guy for me. All right,
yeah,
so I'm gonna have to check out Delmar Glaze,
yes,
Maryland.
sir. Left right versatility as well. So that's a good thing too. But I know Jalen Duncan from last cycle. Like, he had some
Yeah.
early round hype for a little bit. I had him as kind of a day 3 guy, but I thought Glaze was a better prospect from the start, and I
Okay.
think Glaze has been very good. So he's one, and then one more for me. And man, I could go down the list. I'm kind of scrolling down here, but shoot, I think one more that I would emphasize is Brandon Coleman from TCU. That's one
Okay.
more. He played left tackle in 2022 and played guard in 2020. What? Actually, he played guard and tackle. He shifted between those two in 2023. But he's a player who he started out. He lived in Germany for a lot of his childhood and came to the U.S. a little bit later, I think midway through high school. So he's still pretty new to football. Brandon Coleman is. He's got a basketball background, but
Mm.
another guy who's one of those, around 6'4.5", 320, over 34-inch arms. So again, really good frame that you're working with. And he's another big athlete. He was on Feldman's Freaks with a documented 35-inch vertical, which is
Shoot.
pretty insane for an offensive
Yeah.
lineman, right? So I think some people will project him to guard. I think he can stay at tackle. I think right off the bat, you've got a really good depth piece that you're working with. There are a few technical things that he can improve, but I do think, some of the flashes of base leveraging and having the angle awareness, I think he's got that for sure. And I think you're working with a guy who has the length and the controlled lean and the knee bend to, control reps from the start. So I think that athleticism, that versatility, that immediate versatility is very appealing with him. And you're getting a guy who's at the very start of his developmental track because he's so new to football. So I think getting on the ground floor with that and seeing what he can become again, I'm always a fan of kind of taking those calculated leaps on guys who are trending up, but also have a long way to go.
Yeah. Hey, I like it. Okay, so you gave me two names to watch here: TCU, Coleman, and then we got DeMar Glaze, Maryland. These are two guys I'm going to check out now. I appreciate it. For the
Yes,
Broncos, we're
sir.
looking for offensive line depth. Really, the Broncos. I'm looking for anything that is good at the moment. Is sometimes here. Sometimes here in Denver, there's not a lot
Anything
of
that is
pieces
good.
I can bet on in the future right now. Big draft for the Broncos, not a lot of picks. So these are two guys I have to watch. But Ian, thank you so much for coming on, man. You are amazing draft analyst. Like I said, I'm inviting just the people that are my favorites, and you're definitely one of them. If you guys want to go follow him, that's IC_draft
Yeah.
on Twitter. He literally put out 4 articles today. From what I'm looking at. So he's writing all the time. You heard how many scouting reports he has. And yeah, dude, like, thank you so much. You're fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. I always enjoy talking about, specific team needs. But I think the Broncos, not a lot of capital right now, but I think there is an opportunity for them to at least start gaining some momentum this class. So
Absolutely.
it'll be fun to see what they do.
All right. Well, cool. Again, that is IC_draft on Twitter. Make sure you're following all of his work at Pro Football Network. And until next time, guys, go Broncos.